Lillian Carter had never been the type to dream recklessly. Every decision in her life had been measured, built on careful budgeting, hard work, and an unwavering commitment to making things better for her son. She wasn't the kind of woman who counted on luck. Luck had never really been on her side. But she had always believed in persistence, in showing up, in keeping her head down and doing the work. And now, after years of long hours, aching feet, and clients who sometimes treated her like part of the furniture, she was finally about to take the biggest step of her life. The salon she had worked at for nearly a decade was one of the best in Dallas, catering to the kind of women who never checked price tags and always assumed their names would be recognized. It had been good to her, in its way. She had learned everything about the business, what worked, what didn't, the details of luxury service that kept clients coming back. But at the end of the day, it wasn't hers. She had spent years making other people's businesses successful, and now it was time to do it for herself. She had been planning this for so long that it felt like muscle memory. The business plan had been polished to perfection. She knew exactly where she wanted to set up shop, how to price services, what kind of experience she wanted to create. She had even picked out the scent of the candles that would sit at the reception desk. Every detail was accounted for. All she needed now was a loan to bring it to life. Walking into the bank, she adjusted the strap of her purse and took a deep breath. It was strange, really. This was the moment she had worked toward for so long, and yet, standing in front of the polished desk of the loan officer, she felt something close to hesitation. It wasn't doubt, exactly. It was something deeper. The weight of everything that had led her here. The loan officer, a middle-aged woman with a pleasant but unreadable expression, typed something into her computer and gave Lillian a quick glance. "And you're applying for a business loan today?" "Yes," Lillian said, smoothing the crisp edge of the folder in her hands. "I have all my documents ready." The woman nodded and clicked through a few more screens. "Let me just pull up your account." Lillian waited, watching as the woman's fingers moved across the keyboard, her expression unchanged at first. Then she paused. A small frown formed on her face. She typed something else, a little slower this time. Her gaze flicked up to Lillian, then back to the screen. Lillian felt a shift in the air. The woman cleared her throat. "Ms. Carter, I'm seeing something unusual here." Lillian straightened. "Unusual?" The woman turned the screen slightly, not enough for Lillian to see, but enough to make it clear that whatever she was looking at was unexpected. "Why do you need a loan?" the woman asked carefully. "You already have millions in your account." Lillian let out a small, confused laugh. What?" The woman turned the screen fully now, her tone shifting from polite professionalism to something closer to concern. "Your balance. You have a little over, well, quite a bit more than what you're requesting." Lillian leaned forward, her stomach tightening. She had barely more than a few $1,000s saved. What was this woman talking about? "That's not possible," she said. I don't even have an account with this bank." The woman's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Well, according to our records, you do." Lillian shook her head, gripping the edge of her chair. "There has to be a mistake." The woman hesitated, then turned back to the screen. "It shows that these funds were transferred as part of an estate settlement." She scrolled down. "From Elijah Harrington." The words barely registered. They didn't make sense. Elijah Harrington? The name meant nothing to her. The loan officer looked back up, her expression more careful now, her tone softer. "It's listed here as an inheritance from your late husband." Lillian felt the air go thin around her. "My what?" Lillian let out a short laugh, the kind that slipped out when something was so absurd it didn't deserve to be taken seriously. "That's not possible," she said, shaking her head. "I don't even have an account with this bank." The loan officer, a woman who had started this meeting looking slightly bored, was now sitting up straighter, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Well, according to our records, you do. Lillian leaned forward, her pulse quickening. There has to be some mistake. The officer hesitated before turning the monitor slightly so Lillian could see the screen. Her name was right there. Lillian Carter. The account number was unfamiliar, but the balance was unmistakable. A figure so large that for a moment, her brain refused to process it. The zeros blurred together, an amount of money so wildly out of sync with her reality that it may as well have been Monopoly cash. She blinked. Then blinked again. That says, she swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. That says I have over $8 million. The officer nodded slowly. That's correct. Lillian sat back in her chair, stunned into silence. She had spent her entire adult life making careful calculations, stretching every dollar to the very edge, planning meals, setting aside just enough for rent, childcare, and emergencies. She had memorized price tags in grocery stores, done mental math while filling up her gas tank, and had lived with the kind of financial awareness that never allowed for autopilot. And now this stranger was telling her she had millions? She shook her head. That can't be right. I'd know if I had that kind of money. The officer tapped her keyboard again, her expression growing more cautious. It appears to have been transferred to you as part of an estate settlement. Lillian frowned. Estate? The woman nodded and scrolled. Yes. She squinted at the screen. Elijah Harrington. The name meant nothing to her. It was just a collection of syllables, completely unfamiliar, like she was being told she had inherited money from some distant royal family she'd never heard of. I don't know anyone named Elijah Harrington, she said, her voice sharper now. The woman hesitated before glancing back at her screen. It says here that he was your husband. Lillian laughed again, but this time it was a hollow, brittle sound. Excuse me? The officer's fingers hovered over the keyboard as if she was unsure how much she should be saying. According to the legal documents attached to this transfer, you were listed as Mr. Harrington's wife. Lillian stared at her. That's ridiculous. I understand this must be surprising. The officer's voice had softened into something almost apologetic, the way someone might break the news of a clerical error that resulted in a missed paycheck, not the news that a woman who had never been married had somehow acquired a billionaire husband without her knowledge. Lillian leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk. There has to be a mistake. I have never been married to anyone, let alone, she gestured vaguely toward the computer screen. Whoever that is. The officer gave her a careful look. Miss Carter, Elijah Harrington passed away 5 years ago. Her body tensed. 5 years ago. A husband she never met. A fortune she never earned. None of this made sense. The officer cleared her throat, clicking again. The estate transfer was processed through legal channels. The documents are all here. Lillian's mind was racing. Some kind of clerical error, a mix-up, something fixable. But the numbers on the screen were real. The bank recognized them. The system recognized them. And worst of all, whoever had set this up had used her real name. Her real information. As if she had actually been Elijah Harrington's wife. Her voice was unsteady when she spoke. I want to see the paperwork. The officer hesitated, then nodded. Of course. I can print out a copy for you. Lillian watched as the printer whirred to life, spitting out crisp, white sheets. She reached for them with fingers that felt strangely numb. And there it was. Her name, next to Elijah Harrington's. On an official marriage certificate. Dated 5 years ago. Lillian stood frozen in the middle of the bank, gripping the stack of papers so tightly her fingers ached. Late husband. The words clung to her like wet fabric, heavy and suffocating. There had been plenty of absurd moments in her life, accidentally waving back at someone who wasn't waving at her, realizing too late that she had spinach in her teeth after an important conversation, once even showing up to a job interview on the wrong day. But this was something else entirely. She wasn't married. She had never been married. She had never even come close. And yet, there it was, in crisp black ink, her name, tied permanently to a dead billionaire she had never met. Her stomach twisted. The logical part of her brain tried to reason through it. Mistakes happened. Paperwork errors, clerical misfilings, some other bureaucratic nightmare that could be straightened out with a few phone calls. But then there was the money. The millions of dollars that had landed in her name, sitting in an account she had never opened. That wasn't a simple mix-up. That was intentional. Her chest tightened as she pushed away from the desk, barely muttering a thank you to the loan officer before bolting for the door. Her body moved on instinct, carrying her straight to her car. She turned the key, but for a moment, she just sat there, breathing too fast, gripping the steering wheel like it might anchor her to reality. This was fixable. It had to be fixable. The county clerk's office was a 15-minute drive away, tucked inside a dull government building where time seemed to stretch and slow. Lillian had only ever been there once, years ago, when she needed a copy of her son's birth certificate for school records. She remembered the long wait, the scratchy fabric of the chairs, the smell of paper and toner. She parked haphazardly, barely checking her spot before shoving open the car door. Her feet carried her forward with single-minded determination, up the concrete steps and through the glass entrance. The clerk's office was nearly empty, just a couple of people seated on the plastic chairs and a bored-looking employee behind the counter. Lillian approached, hands clenched at her sides. "Hi, I need to look up a marriage record." The woman behind the desk barely glanced up. "Do you have the names and approximate date?" Lillian swallowed. "Yes. Lillian Carter and Elijah Harrington." The words felt unnatural in her mouth. It would have been 5 years ago. The woman clicked around on her keyboard, then frowned slightly at the screen. "You looking for a copy?" "Yes." "Driver's license?" Lillian fumbled with her wallet, pulled out her ID, and slid it across the counter. The woman barely looked at it before disappearing into a back room. Lillian stood there, heart pounding. It was fine. She was going to get the record, see the error, and fix it. The clerk returned, a single sheet of paper in hand. She set it down on the counter, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the top line. "There you go." Lillian stared at it. It was real. Her name. Elijah Harrington's name. A legally binding document declaring them husband and wife. The date, 5 years ago. Her breath hitched. There has to be some mistake. The woman shrugged. "It's what's in the system. If you need to dispute it, you'd have to go through the courts." Lillian barely heard her. The page swam in her vision. The signature at the bottom, the one that was supposed to be hers, looked eerily accurate. Not just a scribble, not something easily dismissed as a forgery. It looked like she had signed it herself. Lillian barely remembered the drive home. Her hands shook the entire way, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached. The marriage certificate sat on the passenger seat, taunting her, as if daring her to argue with it. She wanted to crumple it up, throw it out the window, pretend she had never seen it, but the truth was, it was real. It was official. And it had her name on it. By the time she reached her apartment, she felt sick. She pushed through the door, tossed her keys onto the counter, and paced the small living room, trying to make sense of it. There had to be an explanation. There had to be a way to untangle this mess. Her laptop sat on the coffee table, half buried under a stack of mail and her son's school papers. She shoved everything aside and opened it, her fingers moving fast as she pulled up a search bar. Elijah Harrington. If she had really been married to this man, she needed to know exactly who he was. The results loaded instantly. She stared at the screen, blinking at the sheer number of articles, news stories, and interviews attached to his name. This wasn't just some random businessman. He had been a force. She clicked the first link, an old Forbes profile. Elijah Harrington had been a billionaire. Not just successful, untouchable. He had built a business empire that spanned real estate, finance, and tech investments. The article painted him as brilliant, ruthless, the kind of man who never took no for an answer. There was an old photo of him at a corporate event, dressed in an expensive suit, standing next to some politician whose name she didn't recognize. He looked sharp, confident. She scrolled further, past articles on market acquisitions and aggressive business strategies, until she found one about his personal life. The headline made her breath catch. Mysterious mogul, Elijah Harrington's private life remains an enigma. She clicked on it, scanning quickly. No known long-term relationships. No publicized engagements. Rumors about a few high-profile affairs, but nothing confirmed. The piece described him as intensely private, someone who kept the world at arm's length. He had lived in a sprawling estate just outside the city, rarely seen at social events unless they were directly tied to business. Nowhere did it mention a wife. Lillian rubbed her temples. This wasn't making sense. She would have remembered marrying a billionaire. She would have remembered being anywhere near a man like this. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she kept digging. She found news footage from 5 years ago, covering his sudden death. Billionaire Elijah Harrington presumed dead after boating accident. She clicked the video. A serious-looking reporter stood outside a marina, talking about how his yacht had been found abandoned, no sign of him anywhere. No body was ever recovered. He had been declared dead after an extensive search led to nothing. The police had called it an accident. Some speculated it was something darker. Lillian exhaled sharply. It didn't add up. None of it did. She pulled up a map, zooming out from her tiny apartment in Dallas to the gated estate listed as his last known address. She had never been anywhere near that part of the city. She didn't know anyone who ran in those circles. The most expensive place she had ever set foot in was a high-end salon where the clients expected their lattes steamed to precisely 140 degrees. Whoever Elijah Harrington had been, he had existed in a world completely separate from hers. So how the hell had she ended up legally tied to him? Lillian scrolled through article after article, each one unraveling the pristine image the media had once painted of Elijah Harrington. At first glance, he had been a titan of industry, a self-made billionaire with an empire spanning multiple sectors. But underneath the carefully curated public persona, there was something darker. A lawsuit filed by former investors alleged fraudulent misrepresentation of assets. A real estate deal that collapsed overnight, leaving hundreds of employees without jobs. A series of offshore accounts flagged for suspicious activity. The deeper she dug, the worse it became. Tax fraud allegations. Financial scandals. Accusations that he had manipulated stock prices to inflate the value of his companies. She sat back against the couch, rubbing her temple with her free hand. This was the man she had supposedly married. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed in another search. Elijah Harrington faked death. It felt ridiculous. Sensational. The kind of thing conspiracy theorists posted in comment sections. But the results suggested otherwise. A few fringe blogs had picked up the idea years ago, spinning wild theories about how a man as powerful as Elijah Harrington wouldn't have simply disappeared in a boating accident. But even the more reputable sources hinted at inconsistencies. A reporter had questioned why no body had ever been recovered, why the security footage from the marina had gaps in the recording, why none of Elijah's closest associates had seemed particularly surprised when the official declaration of death was made. There were whispers that he had been on the verge of something, an indictment, a federal investigation, some kind of reckoning. Lillian's stomach twisted. If these stories were even partially true, then his death had been more than just convenient. It had been necessary. And somehow, she was tangled up in it. Lillian's laptop screen glowed in the dimly lit apartment, casting sharp shadows across her face as she leaned forward, scrolling through yet another article. Her fingers were stiff from hours of clicking, her eyes dry from staring at the endless flood of information. Elijah Harrington's name was all over the internet, but now, another name was appearing just as often. Sebastian Carter. The business partner. The man who had built Harrington Enterprises alongside Elijah. Ruthless. Strategic. Charismatic when needed, but cold when it mattered. He was the kind of executive who knew how to make things disappear: numbers, deals, people who got in the way. His name was mentioned in nearly every lawsuit connected to the company, but there was a pattern. Whenever accusations got too close, the evidence pointed elsewhere. When fraud was uncovered, it was traced back to Elijah. When money vanished, it had Elijah's signature on the documents. And when the authorities started investigating, it was Elijah's death that conveniently ended any further questioning. Sebastian, on the other hand, had survived it all. There was no indictment, no trial, no conviction. Somehow, he had emerged clean while his business partner became the sole villain of the story. Lillian sat back, exhaling slowly. If Elijah had truly faked his death, had he done it to escape justice? Or had he been the fall guy all along? Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she typed, "Sebastian Carter contact information." Nothing. No email, no direct phone number. His personal life was as locked down as his business records. She searched for his company, clicking through old press releases and interviews, looking for any sign of how to reach him. It was a dead end. He wasn't the kind of man who made himself easy to find. Frustration gnawed at her. She needed answers, but Sebastian Carter wasn't an option. Then, in one of the articles detailing the lawsuits, she spotted a familiar name. A law firm, one that had represented Harrington Enterprises through every scandal, every lawsuit, every whisper of fraud. Lillian's pulse quickened. If Sebastian Carter wasn't reachable, maybe the people who cleaned up his messes were. She grabbed her keys. If she wanted answers, that was where she had to start. The law firm's office was exactly what Lillian expected: sleek, expensive, and designed to intimidate. The kind of place where powerful men smoothed out their messes over whiskey and quiet legal settlements. The air smelled like leather and old books, the waiting area a perfect blend of minimalism and money. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled hair and an expression that suggested she had no patience for unplanned visitors, barely looked up as Lillian approached the desk. "Do you have an appointment?" the woman asked, tapping something into her computer. Lillian took a steadying breath. "No, but I need to speak with someone about an urgent legal matter." The receptionist's eyes flickered up briefly, unimpressed. "What is this regarding?" Lillian hesitated. She had no idea how much to say. If she walked in announcing that she was supposedly Elijah Harrington's widow, would they laugh her out of the building? Or worse, would they already know exactly who she was? She forced herself to sound calm. "It's regarding an estate issue. I need to correct a mistake." That at least made the woman pause. Estate issues meant money, and money meant important clients. Name? Lillian Carter. The receptionist typed, then stopped. Lillian watched as something flickered across the woman's face, just for a split second, before she recovered, smoothing her features into the same neutral mask. "Wait here," she said, standing and disappearing through a set of large mahogany doors. Lillian's stomach knotted. That reaction wasn't nothing. The woman recognized her name. Or at least, recognized that it meant something. She took a seat on one of the stiff leather chairs, gripping the strap of her purse as if that might help her hold on to her nerves. She glanced at the reception desk, where the woman had returned, now deliberately avoiding eye contact. Minutes stretched. Then more minutes. The wall opposite her had an oversized clock, the kind that ticked a little too loudly in the silence. She checked her phone. 25 minutes had passed. Then 40. She shifted in her chair, debating whether she should just leave. Maybe this had been a mistake. Maybe she had walked straight into something she didn't understand. Nearly an hour had passed when the mahogany doors finally swung open again. And this time, it wasn't the receptionist who stepped through. It was Sebastian Carter. The man who stepped into the room was nothing like the version of him she had read about. Lillian had expected someone cold, calculating, someone who operated in the gray spaces of morality without a second thought. But the man who walked toward her had a smile so warm, so effortlessly charming, that for a moment, she thought she must have the wrong Sebastian Carter. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly, stretching out a hand. "I'm so glad you came." His voice was rich, his handshake firm but not overpowering. The kind of grip designed to make a person feel at ease. His tailored suit was perfectly pressed, his dark hair just slightly tousled in a way that made him look more approachable, like he wasn't the kind of man who could destroy a person with a single phone call. Lillian didn't trust any of it. She took her hand back, steadying herself. "You were expecting me?" Sebastian let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as he sat across from her. "Expecting?" "Not exactly." "Hoping?" "Yes." He leaned back, completely at ease, like they were old acquaintances catching up over coffee instead of two strangers meeting under wildly suspicious circumstances. "We've been trying to reach you for quite some time," he said, clasping his hands together. "Honestly, I can't tell you how relieved I am to finally have you here. At least there are still honest people in this world." Lillian blinked. "Excuse me?" Sebastian sighed, shaking his head with an exasperated but good-natured smile. "This whole mess. I can't imagine how confusing it must have been for you. A woman minding her own business, suddenly finding herself in the middle of a legal disaster. It's absurd, really." She stared at him, waiting. He gave her a sympathetic look. "I assume that's why you came in today? To clear everything up?" She nodded slowly. "That's right. I want to know how I ended up legally married to a dead man I've never met." Sebastian pressed his lips together, like the whole thing just pained him. "Miss Carter, I can assure you, this was nothing more than a terrible mix-up. There was no marriage. No actual relationship. Just a bureaucratic error that should have been handled years ago." Lillian narrowed her eyes. "A bureaucratic error?" He let out another soft chuckle. "Believe me, I know how insane that sounds." He exhaled and sat forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Elijah's death," he hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "It was a lot. Not just for me, but for everyone who worked with him. He left behind an empire, lawsuits, financial chaos. It was overwhelming. And in the middle of all that, mistakes were made. Somewhere along the line, your name was added where it shouldn't have been, and when we tried to undo the error, well, you were nowhere to be found." Lillian stared at him. "Nowhere to be found?" Sebastian gave a small shrug. "No forwarding address, no phone number. You weren't responding to any official communications. At one point, we even thought maybe you had chosen to disappear." She nearly laughed. She had been in the same apartment for years, using the same phone number, living the same life. No one had ever contacted her about this. Sebastian spread his hands, as if all of this had been completely out of his control. "But now, here you are. And I promise you, we are more than ready to fix this. It will take a little paperwork, of course, but it's a simple process. You'll be compensated for any inconvenience, of course." I can't imagine what it must have been like to discover something like this. Lillian clenched her jaw. He was so smooth, so confident, as if he had been rehearsing this speech for years. It should have been comforting. It should have put her at ease. It didn't. Sebastian smiled, the kind of smile designed to put people at ease, the kind that made you believe everything was under control. He clasped his hands together on the table, leaning in just slightly, like they were co-conspirators in some absurd mix-up rather than strangers thrown into a situation that made absolutely no sense. And of course, he said smoothly, we want to make this right. This has been a massive oversight on our part, and I can't imagine the stress it's caused you. He sighed, shaking his head as if he himself had lost sleep over it. The least we can do is compensate you for the trouble. Lillian exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease just a little. Finally, someone was acknowledging how ridiculous this all was. Someone was offering a solution, a logical explanation. I can't tell you how relieved I am to hear that, she said, letting out a breathy laugh. I mean, I walked in here not even knowing how to begin fixing this. Sebastian gave her a sympathetic smile, like he had been expecting her to say that. I completely understand. That's why we've already started putting things in motion to sort it out. If you come back tomorrow, everything will be ready. Lillian blinked. Tomorrow? Yes. Just a bit of paperwork, and then we can go to the bank together, get it all straightened out. She nodded quickly. That made sense. A process like this probably took time. And after that? Sebastian spread his hands. After that, it will be like this never happened. You won't have to worry about any of it. A weight lifted off her chest. She hadn't realized just how much she had been bracing for something worse, something impossibly complicated. Wow, she said, shaking her head. I really wasn't expecting it to be this simple. Sebastian chuckled. Honestly, neither were we. But we're just glad you came in. Now we can finally fix this. Lillian smiled, a real one this time. She could feel herself unclenching, the exhaustion of the last 24 hours finally catching up to her. I'll be here tomorrow, she said, standing up. And really, thank you. This has been overwhelming, and I appreciate you taking the time to explain everything. Sebastian stood with her, offering another warm handshake. It's the least we can do. I'll see you tomorrow. She walked out of the law office feeling light, the air outside cooler than she remembered. It was almost laughable, the way she had worked herself up over this, the hours of frantic Googling, the paranoia creeping in as she imagined worst-case scenarios. It had all been a mistake. And tomorrow, it would be over. Lillian stepped out of the law firm and into the bright afternoon sun, feeling lighter than she had in days. The weight in her chest, the knot in her stomach, gone. It was going to be fine. It had all been a ridiculous, bureaucratic mistake, and tomorrow, it would be corrected. She would sign some paperwork, they would go to the bank, and then she could move on with her life. She hadn't even realized how much tension she had been carrying until now. She walked to her car with a bounce in her step, pulling out her keys with the kind of casualness she hadn't felt since before this whole mess started. The moment she slid into the driver's seat, she let out a small laugh, an actual, relieved, almost giddy laugh. It was over. Traffic was heavy, which gave her too much time to think, but for once, she wasn't spiraling. She let her mind wander, thinking about how different her life would be once this was officially behind her. The salon, the business she had been dreaming about for years, she could finally get back to focusing on that instead of unraveling some absurd legal mix-up. But as she sat at a red light, tapping her fingers against the steering wheel, a small thought surfaced. A small, insignificant, almost meaningless thought. Sebastian Carter had been incredibly warm. That, in itself, wasn't strange. Plenty of powerful men knew how to turn on the charm. But it wasn't just the charm. It was the way he had spoken to her, the way he had gone out of his way to reassure her, to make her feel safe. It wasn't what she had expected at all. She had read everything about him, or at least everything that was available online. He was a businessman, one of those cutthroat types who got what they wanted without caring about collateral damage. Ruthless, aggressive, the kind of man who had survived scandals while others took the fall. And yet, the moment she had walked through that door, he had acted like he had all the time in the world for her. The light turned green, and she pressed on the gas, shaking her head at herself. What was she doing? Picking apart the way a man had been nice to her? Overanalyzing a situation that was already being resolved? It was paranoia, that's all. A natural response to the mess she had been dropped into. But then another thought crept in. The waiting. They had made her wait for nearly an hour. That was the part that wasn't sitting right. She had walked in unannounced, expecting to speak to some junior lawyer who would shuffle through her file and send her home with instructions to call back next week. But instead, they had asked her to wait, and not just for a little while, long enough that she had started to question whether she should leave. And then, instead of a lawyer, instead of some legal assistant handling an obvious clerical mistake, a millionaire had walked through the door. A man who, by all accounts, was incredibly busy. A man who had no reason to personally involve himself in a situation like this. Lillian merged onto the freeway, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. He had known exactly who she was the moment he walked in. He had thanked her for coming, like she was doing him a favor. And he had already decided, before even speaking to her, that they would meet again tomorrow. She was halfway home when the lightness in her chest started to dissolve. Lillian pulled into her apartment complex, turned off the engine, and sat there, staring at the dashboard. The car suddenly felt too small, the air inside it too thick. Her heart wasn't racing exactly, but something inside her had shifted, like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place. She grabbed her phone and opened a new search. Elijah Harrington fraud investigation. The results were familiar, but this time, she wasn't just skimming. She was reading between the lines. There it was, clear as day. Elijah had been at the center of every financial scandal tied to Harrington Enterprises. His name was on the documents, his signature on the accounts, his face on every article exposing the fraud. The lawsuits, the investigations, everything pointed directly to him. And Sebastian Carter? Not one charge. Not one lawsuit that had stuck. Not one frozen account. It was almost impressive, really, the way he had emerged completely untouched while his business partner took the fall. And then there was the timing. Elijah had died in a boating accident right as the investigations were heating up. The moment he disappeared, the company unraveled, lawsuits piled up, and the assets? Gone. Not gone. Moved. Lillian gripped her phone tighter. Elijah had died at the perfect moment. And all of his wealth, his assets, his businesses, every last piece of it, had already been transferred out of his name. She scrolled back to the marriage certificate, pulling up the image she had taken on her phone at the clerk's office. Her name. The money had gone somewhere. It had gone to her. Her mouth went dry. This wasn't a clerical error. This wasn't an unfortunate mix-up. She had been used. She had no idea how, or why, or who had chosen her, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that Sebastian Carter knew exactly who she was before she even walked through that door. He hadn't been surprised to see her. He had been waiting. She looked back at their conversation in her head, turning over every moment like an investigator looking for cracks in a story. Sebastian had been too smooth, too reassuring. He had known she would come in confused, panicked, eager to fix the mistake. And he had been ready with a solution before she even had time to process what was happening. The delay. The hour she had spent in the waiting room, debating whether she should leave. They hadn't been preparing paperwork. They had been preparing a response. And now, she had done exactly what they wanted. She had agreed to come back. To walk right into whatever they had planned for her. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. If she knew the truth now, it meant they knew she knew. She wasn't just some random name attached to a legal glitch anymore. She was a loose end. Lillian sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, hands curled around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The clock on the wall read past midnight, but sleep wasn't an option. Not tonight. Not when everything had shifted so violently in the past few hours. She pulled up her bank account for the 5th time, refreshing the screen like the numbers might suddenly vanish. But they were still there. Every last cent. The money hadn't moved. Yet. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She knew exactly what would happen if she walked into that meeting tomorrow. They would smile at her, slide the paperwork across the table, make it all seem so reasonable, so logical. It had been a mistake, after all. And they were here to correct it. She could already hear Sebastian's voice in her head, smooth and reassuring. Just a few signatures, Ms. Carter, and we'll take care of everything for you. Except they wouldn't just take care of everything. They would erase her. She had been a pawn, chosen for her quiet life, her unremarkable existence, the kind of person who wouldn't ask questions. She wasn't supposed to have found out. She wasn't supposed to have noticed how neatly all the pieces fit together. But they had miscalculated. She wasn't some fool who would walk into a trap with a grateful smile. She wasn't going to hand over the only proof that something much bigger was happening here. Her hands clenched into fists. She was done being used. Her mind raced through the possibilities. She had to move quickly. There was no way they hadn't flagged her account already, no way they weren't prepared to shut everything down the second she walked through that law firm's doors. She pushed away from the table and grabbed her bag, her pulse steady and determined now. She needed to think faster than them. Move faster. By morning, she would be gone. And so would the money. Lillian barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the last 24 hours. The moment at the bank. The legal documents. The absurdly charming Sebastian Carter, sitting across from her with that easy smile, reassuring her that everything would be fixed if she just played along. The weight of what she had uncovered pressed down on her chest, but underneath the fear, something else was burning now. Fury. They had picked her because they thought she wouldn't notice. Because she was a nobody to them, a single mom cutting hair in a salon, someone who wouldn't ask questions. They thought she'd be grateful for their help, sign whatever they put in front of her, and disappear back into the background. She rolled over and grabbed her phone, checking her bank account again. The money was still there. But she knew it wouldn't be for long. The moment she walked into that meeting, it would be gone. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, rubbing her face as she stood up. She needed to move fast. The sky was still dark when she left her apartment. The city was just starting to wake up, streetlights flickering off, the occasional early commuter yawning behind the wheel. She pulled into a parking lot outside a coffee shop and opened her laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. She had no idea how much time she had before they acted, but she wasn't going to wait around to find out. She set up 3 new accounts, splitting the money between them. One at a major bank, one at a smaller credit union, and one at an online financial institution that would take longer to trace. Her hands shook as she finalized the transfers, her heart hammering in her chest. She had never moved more than a few $100s at a time before. Now, millions were shifting at her command. She clicked the final confirmation and exhaled sharply. It was done. But that wasn't enough. If they could fabricate a marriage, they could fabricate anything. She needed to disappear. She pulled up a website she had read about once, years ago, half as a joke, half as a curiosity. A service that helped people vanish, legally. New identification, new address, new everything. She followed the steps, filling out forms, choosing a name she barely recognized. It wasn't perfect, but it would buy her time. By mid-morning, she walked into a small branch of her newly chosen bank, withdrawing as much cash as she could without triggering suspicion. She stuffed the envelope deep into her bag, her fingers gripping the strap tightly as she walked out onto the street. Her phone buzzed. A new email. From the law firm. Just a friendly reminder about her meeting today. Lillian stared at the screen, pulse steady now. Sebastian Carter was waiting. But by the time he realized what had happened, she would already be gone. The air smelled different here. It wasn't just the absence of the familiar, it was something else, something lighter. Lillian stood in front of the freshly painted storefront, the gold lettering on the glass window catching the late afternoon sun. The name she had chosen for her salon felt right, even if it wasn't the name she had dreamed of using back in Dallas. But that life was gone, neatly folded away, just like the name she had left behind. She had done it. The shop was small but beautiful, with high ceilings and big windows that let in golden light. The space had been a bakery before, and the faint scent of sugar and flour still lingered in the air. She had spent the last few weeks transforming it: soft leather chairs, deep green walls, mirrors framed in brushed gold. It was modern but warm, elegant but unpretentious. People had warned her not to open a salon in a town where she had no roots, no connections. But they didn't know Lillian. She had built a life from nothing before. This time, she just had a head start. The first week had been quiet. Walk-ins, mostly. A few curious locals who peered inside and then returned a day later, looking like they had made up their minds to trust her with their hair. And then, one morning, a woman with a sharp bob and kind eyes had sat in her chair, let Lillian work her magic, and left looking like she had just walked out of a high-end salon in Manhattan. By that evening, half the town had heard about her. Now, she was booked solid for weeks. She hired 2 assistants. Then a receptionist. Then another stylist. She ran the salon exactly the way she had always dreamed, without the stuffy rules of luxury salons, without the rushed atmosphere of the cheaper chains. It was a place where women lingered after appointments, sipping coffee and flipping through magazines. Where teenagers came in before prom, nervous and excited, and left glowing. No one asked about her past. No one knew. She never talked about the money. She didn't flaunt it. She didn't upgrade to a fancy car or move into a mansion. The house she rented was comfortable, the kind of place where she could cook dinner with her son and sit on the porch in the evenings. For the first time in her life, she wasn't struggling. She was thriving. And for the first time in a long time, she finally felt safe. The night was quiet. The kind of quiet Lillian had come to love: the hum of crickets outside, the occasional distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the soft creak of the porch as the wind moved through the wooden beams. She had just put her son to bed, kissed his forehead, smoothed his curls, and listened to his breathing slow as he drifted to sleep. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of wine, rolling the stem between her fingers as she leaned against the counter. There was a time when nights like this had been a luxury, when she would have been too exhausted from work, too anxious about bills, too drained by the weight of everything. But now, things were different. She exhaled, letting herself enjoy the moment. Then, there was a knock. Her body went cold so fast it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. No one knocked on her door this late. She set the glass down carefully, her fingers suddenly unsteady. It was probably nothing. A neighbor, maybe. A delivery mix-up. But something in her gut twisted, warning her before her mind could catch up. She moved toward the door, pulse hammering, her bare feet soundless against the hardwood floor. Through the peephole, all she could see was darkness. A tall figure stood just beyond the porch light, their face hidden in shadow. She didn't want to open it. Every nerve in her body told her to lock the door, turn off the lights, pretend she wasn't home. But before she could make that decision, a voice cut through the silence. Lillian. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't possible. Slowly, she unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. And there he was. Elijah Harrington. Very much alive. His eyes, sharp and knowing, studied her face like he was committing it to memory. The corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly, like this moment was amusing to him. Then he spoke. "We need to talk." Lillian tightened her grip on the doorframe, forcing herself to breathe. She could feel the blood rushing to her ears, the way her stomach flipped, the way every instinct told her to slam the door and lock every bolt. But she didn't. Instead, she blinked, tilted her head just slightly, and let her mouth part in what she hoped was a convincingly stunned expression. "Elijah?" Her voice came out soft, barely above a whisper. "But, you're dead." Elijah Harrington smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold, either. It was something in between, the kind of expression a man like him would wear when he was enjoying a private joke. His eyes never left hers, sharp and calculating, like he was waiting for her next move. "I imagine this is a shock," he said, his voice smooth, almost gentle. Lillian swallowed, widening her eyes just enough to sell it. "A shock?" She let out a breathy, disbelieving laugh. "You think?" Elijah studied her, his expression unreadable. "You must be so confused." She nodded immediately. Completely. She had played this game before, with difficult clients at the salon, with condescending men who thought they could get away with talking down to her. The trick was to make them believe they had the upper hand. Elijah exhaled, as if he had expected this reaction. "I didn't have a choice," he said, slipping his hands into the pockets of his expensive-looking coat. "I had to disappear." Lillian blinked at him. "Disappear?" "For safety reasons." He let the words hang in the air, watching her. She forced herself to look appropriately bewildered. I don't understand." Elijah's mouth quirked like he had already decided she wasn't a threat. "I imagine there's a lot you don't understand." His tone was soft, almost condescending. "But I can explain. If I could just come in." Lillian hesitated, shifting slightly, as if debating. She needed to stall. Let him keep talking. Let him think she was just some overwhelmed woman who had stumbled into something far bigger than herself. "Why now?" she asked instead. "Why come back after all this time?" Elijah's eyes darkened, and just like that, she knew. He wasn't here because he missed his old life. He wasn't here for her. He was here for the money. Lillian moved through the kitchen with deliberate ease, careful not to let her hands shake as she pulled a bottle of whiskey from the shelf. Her heart was hammering in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady. She could feel Elijah watching her, studying her reactions, assessing whether she was still the clueless woman he thought she was. She turned back to him with a small, uneasy smile. "Whiskey, right?" Elijah nodded, removing his coat and draping it over the back of the chair like he had all the time in the world. "Neat." "Of course." The kind of man who faked his own death and came back to collect his fortune wasn't the type to water down his whiskey. Lillian reached for 2 glasses and set them on the counter. As she turned to grab her phone, she let it slip from her fingers, watching as it tumbled off the edge and clattered onto the floor. "Damn it," she muttered, crouching quickly. She kept her head down, fingers moving fast. One text. No names. No details. Just 2 words. "He's here." She hit send and slipped the phone back into her pocket as she straightened. Elijah hadn't moved. He was watching her, his gaze unreadable. "You look nervous," he observed. Lillian forced a weak laugh, pouring the whiskey into the glasses. "Wouldn't you be?" He smiled slightly, like he was pleased with that answer, like he wanted her nervous. He picked up his drink and swirled the amber liquid before taking a slow sip. She mirrored his movements, but barely let the whiskey touch her lips. She needed to stay sharp. Elijah set his glass down and exhaled. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I imagine you have questions." Lillian nodded, letting the hesitation linger on her face. I don't understand. Elijah's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. No, I imagine you wouldn't. She needed to keep him talking. She let out a shaky breath. Why me? Elijah tilted his head slightly, amused. Why not you? Lillian blinked, her fingers tightening around the glass. I mean, of all the people in the world, why did you put my name on everything? Elijah smirked. You were easy. She didn't react, just let the words settle between them like she was still trying to process. He took another slow sip, watching her carefully. You worked at that salon for what, years? Same job, same apartment, same routines. You had no assets, no debts, nothing that would raise any red flags. You were invisible. Lillian swallowed, keeping her expression open, as if she was still struggling to make sense of it. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his voice low and knowing. Sebastian's wife used to get her hair done there, did you know that? Lillian gave the smallest nod, not trusting herself to speak. She mentioned you once. Elijah chuckled, shaking his head slightly. Said you were so simple. No ambition. No attachments. Nothing to lose. Lillian felt something sharp cut through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. You were perfect, Elijah continued. A nobody. Someone who wouldn't ask questions. Someone who wouldn't even notice. She let out a soft, breathless laugh, pretending to be flustered, pretending to be the kind of woman who was still struggling to make sense of all of this. Elijah smirked. It worked, didn't it? Lillian took a slow sip of whiskey as she heard the distant sound of tires rolling up the driveway. Yes. It had worked. But not the way he thought. The knock at the door was loud. Steady. Authority wrapped in sound. Elijah didn't flinch at first. He swirled the last of his whiskey, eyes still on her, as if he wasn't remotely concerned. Lillian, keeping her role intact, widened her eyes and glanced at the door like she had no idea who could be standing on the other side. Another knock, this time sharper. Elijah finally set his glass down, his movements slower now, like something in the air had shifted and he was just starting to notice. You expecting someone? He asked, his voice casual, but there was something else underneath it now. A flicker of tension. Lillian stood, smoothing her hands on her jeans like she was just as surprised as he was. She took 2 steps toward the door before stopping, turning back to look at him, letting just a little bit of something knowing slip into her expression. Elijah's eyes narrowed. A third knock. Something in his posture changed. Slowly, he stood up, his hands resting on the back of the chair, his jaw tightening. He was catching up now, putting together the pieces a second too late. Lillian tilted her head slightly. You think I didn't know why you were here? Elijah didn't respond, but his fingers curled tighter around the chair. The 4th knock came, but this time, it was accompanied by a voice. Police. Open the door. Lillian reached for the knob, her heart pounding now, not with fear, but with something sharper. Elijah took a single step back. Just one. As if, for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't the one in control. She turned the knob and pulled the door open. The officers moved fast. One stepped inside, the other right behind him, both with purpose, their expressions giving away nothing. Elijah Harrington, the taller officer said. You're under arrest. Elijah didn't fight. He didn't argue. He just let out a quiet breath, like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long, very complicated game. One officer pulled his arms behind his back, the click of the handcuffs snapping through the air like punctuation. Elijah turned his head, just slightly, and looked at her, his mouth curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. You were smarter than I thought, he said, his voice almost amused. Lillian let out a breath. Not a laugh, not quite relief, just the last of the weight leaving her chest. She leaned against the doorframe, watching as they led him outside. He had come for what he thought was his. But he had underestimated the woman he chose to steal from. Lillian stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching as the officers guided Elijah toward the squad car. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off his face, throwing sharp shadows over his features, but his expression remained unchanged. He didn't struggle. He didn't protest. He just let out a slow exhale, the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes his game is up but still believes the final score hasn't been settled. She had expected more from him. A smirk, a witty remark, a parting shot meant to get under her skin. But as the officer placed a hand on his head to guide him into the back seat, he turned his head just enough to meet her eyes. That's when the smirk came. Not quite arrogant, not quite resigned. Just the faintest curve of his lips, a silent acknowledgement that this wasn't how he had expected the night to go. One of the officers shut the car door behind him and turned back toward the house. "Miss Carter?" She glanced at him, her face unreadable. "We'll be in touch." She nodded once, then stepped inside and closed the door. The lock clicked into place, and just like that, the house was silent again. No more flashing lights, no more heavy footsteps, no more measured voice trying to convince her he wasn't a man who would lie, steal, and fake his own death. Just her. And the quiet. She lingered for a moment, fingers resting against the cool surface of the door. The rush of the last hour was still in her veins, but underneath it, something calmer was settling in. She had won. She walked back into the kitchen, her eyes falling on the whiskey glass Elijah had left on the counter. It was still half full, sitting there like a ghost of the conversation they had just had. She picked it up, turned it in her hand, watching the liquid swirl for a moment before she walked to the sink and dumped it out. Then she grabbed the bottle and poured herself another. This drink was hers. She carried it to the kitchen table, lowering herself into a chair, exhaling as she took a slow sip. The warmth spread through her chest, but it wasn't just the alcohol. It was the finality of it all. The quiet satisfaction of knowing she had seen through every lie, every manipulation, and had walked away unscathed. She ran a finger along the rim of the glass, her mind drifting back to that morning, to the decision that had set all of this into motion. She had gone to the police alone, heart pounding, palms sweating, uncertain if she was making the right call. The station had smelled like stale coffee and paperwork. She had asked for the detective handling the fraud investigation, the one whose name she had found in an old article about Elijah's missing fortune. They had sent her to a small office with gray walls and a single desk cluttered with reports. The detective, a man in his 50s with tired eyes but a sharp gaze, had listened without interrupting. She had laid it all out. The marriage certificate, the bank account, the law firm, Sebastian, the money. And then, finally, Elijah. When she had finished, he had leaned back in his chair and studied her for a long moment. "So," he had said, tapping his fingers against the desk, "what do you want to do about it?" And together, they had devised a little plan. She had known Elijah would come. He had no other choice. The money was gone, the accounts were untouchable, and she was the last loose end. He had faked his death, but now, he had no choice but to step back into the world, and the moment he did, he was vulnerable. So she had played her part. The confusion, the wide-eyed shock, the stammered questions. She had poured his drink, let him think he was winning, let him think she was still the simple woman who had been chosen because she wasn't supposed to notice anything. And then she had texted 2 words. "He's here." She took another sip, rolling the whiskey over her tongue, letting the satisfaction settle in. Elijah was gone. Sebastian would be next. And as for her, she was exactly where she was meant to be. No regrets. Not a single one. The morning was quiet in the way only small towns could be, slow, unhurried, stretching itself awake as if there was no rush to get anywhere. Lillian stood outside her salon, the key poised between her fingers, her other hand wrapped around a cup of coffee still warm enough to send small curls of steam into the crisp air. She took a slow sip, savoring the rich bitterness as she watched the town come to life. The bakery across the street had just flipped its open sign, and already, a small group of locals had gathered inside, laughing softly as they waited for their coffee and pastries. Down the block, a florist was setting out fresh bouquets, the bright colors standing out against the pale morning light. A runner in a gray hoodie passed by, nodding at her like they did every morning. This life, the one she had built from the ground up, was simple, ordinary. And she loved it. She had spent so much of her life waiting. Waiting for the next bill, the next paycheck, the next round of stress that would press against her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. Waiting for someone to tell her what her limits were, how far she was allowed to go, how small she was supposed to keep herself. She wasn't waiting anymore. She turned, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The salon smelled like eucalyptus and vanilla, the scent of the candles she lit every morning before opening. The chairs were lined up perfectly, the mirrors spotless, the counters arranged just how she liked them. There was a quiet hum of something unspoken in the air, satisfaction, fulfillment, the kind of peace that came from knowing she had built something real. This was hers. Not borrowed. Not given. Not stolen. Hers. She had spent years keeping her head down, playing it safe, following invisible rules she hadn't even realized had been written for her. But when everything had been upended, when she had been dragged into a game she never agreed to play, she hadn't just survived. She had won. Elijah had thought she was weak. Sebastian had thought she was disposable. They had chosen her because she was invisible, because she wasn't supposed to ask questions, because she had been the perfect pawn in their carefully laid out scheme. But they had underestimated her. She had stood in the fire, in the lies, in the tangled web of powerful men who had spent their lives getting away with everything, and she had walked out untouched. No. More than that. She had walked out with everything. The money. The business. The freedom. And best of all, she had walked away owing no one anything. A year ago, she had been someone else. A version of herself that had spent nights doing mental calculations to make sure rent and groceries wouldn't clash. A version that had told herself that dreams were just that, dreams. But that woman didn't exist anymore. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a woman who had fought back. A woman who had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into something new, something strong. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her out of her thoughts. She looked up as her first client of the day walked in, shaking off the morning chill. "Morning, Lillian," the woman said, unwrapping her scarf. Lillian smiled, setting down her coffee, feeling the warmth of her life settling around her like something solid. "Morning," she said. "Let's get started." And just like that, her day began. Her life. Her real life. One she had built with her own hands.